Notice something the next time it happens. You explain a decision once. The other person's face doesn't change. You explain it again, a little more carefully this time. Still nothing. And instead of stopping, some part of you reaches for a third version, as if the right combination of words is still out there somewhere, waiting to unlock them. It rarely comes. And here is the part worth sitting with. Most of the exhaustion people carry around is not from the work they are doing. It is from the defending they are doing underneath it for decisions that were already settled the moment they made them. Today, I want to walk through exactly why this happens, how to tell the difference between someone who genuinely does not understand yet and someone who has already decided not to, and what to actually do with all the energy you get back once you stop performing for an audience that was never going to applaud. This is a longer session because the pattern we are examining runs deep, and a shallow pass at it tends to produce a nice feeling for a few days that fades the moment someone frowns at you again. We are going to build something sturdier than that. One thing worth saying before we begin. If you recognize yourself heavily in what follows, that is not a character flaw being exposed. Almost everyone does this to some degree because almost everyone was raised in an environment where explaining yourself well was treated as a core life skill, without anyone ever teaching the equally important second half of that skill, which is knowing when an explanation has stopped being useful and started being a performance for an audience that already left the theater. It is also worth saying that recognizing this pattern in yourself is by itself already most of the work. The habit thrives on going unexamined, running quietly in the background of ordinary conversations, without ever being named for what it is. Simply being able to notice in real time, I am doing the thing again, is often enough to interrupt the automatic momentum of it, long before you have even mastered any of the specific tools we are about to cover. So let's start with the core distinction that fixes most of this. There are two very different reasons someone does not understand you. One is that they genuinely cannot yet. They are missing context, information, or experience, and a good explanation actually helps close that gap. The other is that they will not. They have already landed somewhere, and no version of your explanation is going to move them. Treating those two situations the same way is where all the energy leaks out. With the first kind of person, explaining is a genuine service. You are adding a missing piece, and eventually the picture comes into focus for them. That is a good use of your breath, and it usually feels collaborative, like you are both working toward the same understanding from different starting points. With the second kind of person, something entirely different is happening, even though it can look identical from the outside. You offer information to someone who has already decided, and the information simply has nowhere to land. It is not that your explanation was poorly constructed. It is that there was never an open door for it to walk through in the first place. This distinction matters because the two situations call for opposite responses, and applying the wrong response to each one produces exactly the exhaustion we are trying to address. Explaining more to someone who genuinely cannot understand yet is patient, generous, and eventually effective. Explaining more to someone who will not understand is neither patient nor generous. It is simply pouring effort into a container with no bottom and mistaking the continued pouring for virtue rather than recognizing it for the drain that it actually is. Think of it like a vending machine with a slot that only takes one specific coin. Some people are that machine. Put in the right coin, the right piece of information delivered at the right moment, and something genuinely shifts inside them. Other people look exactly like that machine from the outside. Same slot, same buttons, same appearance of receptivity, but there is no mechanism behind the glass. You can put coin after coin in for years. Nothing moves, not because your coin was wrong. Because there was never a machine there to begin with, only the appearance of one. The tricky part is that these two types look nearly identical in the moment they are standing in front of you. Someone frowning and asking, but why though could be genuinely trying to understand, working through real confusion toward real clarity. Or they could be someone who has already decided, simply making you work for a verdict they had already reached. before you opened your mouth. The frown looks the same either way. What differs is what happens after you answer. There is a useful way to think about where this confusion originally comes from. Many of us were raised in situations where explaining ourselves genuinely was required and genuinely useful. A child needing to justify a request to a parent, a student needing to show their reasoning to a teacher. In those settings, the person receiving the explanation typically had both the capacity and the willingness to actually update their view based on what they heard. That early pattern taught a lesson that was true at the time, but was never explicitly updated for adulthood, where plenty of the people you now explain yourself to have neither the capacity nor the willingness that made the childhood version of this pattern actually work. Now, here is a reliable way to tell these two situations apart, and it is simpler than it sounds. Watch whether their questions are getting narrower or wider as the conversation continues. Someone genuinely trying to understand asks a question, receives an answer, and their next question is more specific than the last one. They are closing in on something real, narrowing the gap between confusion and clarity one question at a time. You can feel the conversation actually progressing, even if it takes a while to arrive somewhere. Someone who has already decided asks a question, receives an answer, and then asks something completely different next, almost as if your answer evaporated the instant it left your mouth. The questions do not narrow, they multiply. Each answer you give spawns two new questions instead of closing one. That is not curiosity building toward understanding. That is a holding pattern designed, whether consciously or not, to keep you talking without ever requiring the other person to concede anything. Once you can see this pattern clearly, you gain something valuable: permission to stop. If someone's questions have been multiplying rather than narrowing for several rounds in a row, no fifth or sixth explanation is going to change that trajectory. The honest move at that point is not a better explanation. It is recognizing that you are not actually in a conversation anymore. You are in a loop, and loops do not resolve themselves through more input. They resolve through someone deciding to step outside the loop. There is a related signal worth watching for, which is what happens to agreement after you leave the room. Some people nod along to your face, say they understand, seem satisfied, and then you later discover they expressed real doubt to someone else the moment you were gone. This does not necessarily mean they were lying maliciously. Often it simply means the nod was the path of least resistance in the moment, easier than pushing back directly, while their actual position never moved an inch. Chasing genuine agreement from someone whose agreement was never really on offer is a specific and exhausting trap, because you keep sensing you almost got there, when in fact there was nowhere to get to. It is worth adding a note of caution here, because this framework can be misused if applied too broadly. Not every disagreement or hesitation from another person means they belong in the will not understand category. Genuine skepticism, asked in good faith, is a normal and healthy part of any real relationship, and treating every raised eyebrow as evidence of a closed mind risks becoming defensive in the opposite direction, dismissing legitimate concern as mere noise. The actual test remains the pattern over time, narrowing questions versus multiplying ones, rather than any single moment of doubt, however uncomfortable that moment feels in the instant it happens. Now here is what this actually cost you, and almost nobody ever adds it up carefully enough to notice the full size of the bill. Picture your available energy each day like a jar of water you start with every morning. Most people assume the jar only empties from actual work, the meetings, the tasks, the visible effort. But there is a second, quieter drain that almost nobody tracks. The energy spent rehearsing your case in the shower, replaying an argument you will probably never actually have, defending a decision in your head to an audience that was never going to render a fair verdict either way, regardless of how the argument went. That drain does not feel like anything significant in the moment. A few minutes of mental rehearsal here, a slightly tense exchange there. It feels neutral, almost like background noise, but it is not neutral. It is drawing from the exact same reserve of energy and attention you need for the actual building of your life. and it draws from that reserve quietly, invisibly, the same way a slow leak empties a tire without any single dramatic moment where you notice it happening. Here is a rough way to see the actual size of it. Imagine a modest portion of your daily energy, say a sixth of it, consistently going toward explaining, defending, and preemptively justifying decisions to people who were never going to be moved either way. A sixth of a day repeated across a full year adds up to roughly 2 months of pure mental energy spent on a courtroom that existed only in your own head. Stretch that across 5 years, and you are looking at nearly a full year of your limited time on earth, spent rehearsing defenses for a jury that was never actually deliberating. It is worth being honest that these numbers are illustrative rather than a precise measurement anyone could actually run on themselves. The exact fraction varies enormously from person to person and situation to situation. But the illustrative math still makes an important point true, regardless of the precise figure. This is not a trivial, occasional cost. It is a sustained, compounding one, quietly running in the background of an ordinary life for years at a time, almost entirely unnoticed, precisely because nobody ever taught anyone to add it up in the first place. Here is the part that stings a little more once you actually sit with it. That energy was never neutral, and it was never free. Every hour spent building your case is an hour you did not spend building the actual thing the case was even about. And here is the cruelest twist in the entire pattern. The people who doubted you rarely come around because your argument finally became airtight enough. They come around when they see something real, something built, something undeniable sitting right in front of them. Not because you convinced them with better words, because you stopped needing their agreement at all and built the thing anyway. It is worth pausing on why this twist is so cruel and so easy to miss while you are inside it. The very behavior that feels like it should eventually earn approval, patient, repeated, careful explanation, is often the exact behavior standing between you and the thing that actually earns approval, which is visible results. Every hour spent perfecting your case is an hour not spent producing the evidence that would have made the case unnecessary in the first place. People sense this instinctively, even when they cannot name it, which is part of why persistent over-explainers so often report feeling busy and exhausted, while simultaneously feeling like they have very little to show for any of it. It helps to name a few specific patterns of people who tend to keep this cycle running. Not because naming them is about labeling anyone as a villain, but because recognizing the pattern in the moment is what lets you respond differently the next time it shows up. The first pattern is the endless questioner, someone who seems engaged, seems curious, keeps asking follow-up after follow-up, but whose questions never actually narrow toward any resolution. With this person, the questioning itself is the point, whether or not they realize it. The moment you notice several rounds of widening rather than narrowing questions, you already have your answer, and no further explanation is required. The second pattern is the quiet doubter, the person who nods and says they understand to your face, and then expresses real reservations to someone else once you have left the room. This person is often not acting maliciously. They are usually avoiding an uncomfortable confrontation in the moment. But their nod was never real agreement, and no amount of additional explaining closes a gap that their private position was never going to move on regardless of what you said. It is worth noting that these first two patterns often overlap in the same person, someone who asks endless multiplying questions in front of you and then reveals, secondhand, that none of your answers actually changed anything for them. Recognizing the combination early spares you the specific frustration of feeling like you are making progress in the moment, only to discover afterward that the entire conversation left no lasting mark at all. The third pattern is the guilt-based objector, someone who has not necessarily earned a formal say in your decisions, but has learned that a wounded tone, a disappointed sigh, or a pointed comment tends to reliably pull you back into justifying yourself. This pattern works specifically because it appeals to your sense of fairness or obligation, not because the person actually has a legitimate claim on an explanation. Recognizing this pattern for what it is, A bid for reassurance dressed up as a grievance makes it considerably easier to respond with warmth, but without the extended justification the tone is fishing for. The fourth pattern is the person who listens closely to your explanations, not to understand you, but to collect material. Whatever doubts, insecurities, or reasons you reveal while explaining yourself to this person tend to resurface later, at an inconvenient moment, used against the very decision you were explaining. With this pattern, the safest response is simply offering less raw material in the first place, not because your reasons are shameful, but because this particular audience has already demonstrated what they do with them. These middle two patterns, the guilt-based objector and the material collector, are often the hardest to spot early, because both can initially present as simply being close to you and invested in your life, which of course some people genuinely are. The distinguishing evidence accumulates over time rather than in any single conversation. A guilt-based objector will consistently respond to your autonomy with wounded withdrawal rather than genuine curiosity. A material collector will consistently resurface old vulnerabilities at strategically unhelpful moments. Neither pattern announces itself directly. Both reveal themselves through repetition, which is exactly why a single uncomfortable conversation with either type is not, by itself, sufficient evidence to categorize the relationship this way. The fifth and gentlest pattern is the person who genuinely loves you and is simply frightened by the risk you are taking. This is not a manipulative pattern at all. It comes from real care mixed with real fear, and it deserves a different response than the other four. With this person, you do owe warmth, and you do owe one honest, complete explanation. What you do not owe is an infinite, repeating series of explanations every time their fear resurfaces. Their fear tends to soften over time and evidence, not over additional argument, because their worry was never really about the quality of your reasoning to begin with. It is worth adding that most people carry a mix of these 5 patterns across the different relationships in their life, rather than encountering a single pure type everywhere. A parent might sit squarely in the 5th pattern, while a colleague sits in the 1st, and an old friend sits in the 2nd. Recognizing which pattern you are actually dealing with in any given conversation, rather than responding to all disagreement identically, is what allows you to be warm and patient with the 5th pattern while being appropriately brief with the 1st, without either response feeling inconsistent once you understand why the distinction exists. Seeing the pattern clearly is useful, but a clear diagnosis without a workable response just becomes a more sophisticated kind of frustration. So here is the actual blueprint. In 4 practical moves you can start using immediately. The first move is separating deciding from telling. Make your decision quietly, on your own, or with the very small number of people who have genuinely earned a seat at that particular table through years of demonstrated loyalty and good judgment, not simply through proximity or history. Get the decision genuinely settled in your own mind first. Only afterward do you consider whether, and how much, to share it with anyone else. And when you do share it as a completed fact rather than an open proposal. I have decided to do this closes a door behind you. What do you all think I should do? Hands the entire decision over to a room that never had to live with the consequences of it. Most people do this backwards without realizing it. They form a half decision, still genuinely uncertain, and then bring that half-formed thought out into a group specifically to finish deciding through the reactions they receive. The problem is that the room offering those reactions is rarely equipped to make a good decision on your behalf, since they do not carry the consequences, do not have your full context, and are often responding more to their own fears and projections than to the actual merits of your specific situation. Deciding first and telling second simply relocates the decision-making authority to where it always should have lived, inside the person who actually has to live with the outcome. The second move is learning the genuine power of the short answer. Most people over-explain because they mistake length for respect, as though a longer answer proves you took the other person seriously and a shorter one seems dismissive. The opposite is usually true. A short, calm answer communicates a kind of settledness that a long, elaborate one rarely manages to convey, precisely because length often signals an unconscious need to keep convincing. When someone asks why, and you can genuinely sense they are not asking to understand but to find an opening, you do not owe 5 carefully constructed reasons. "I have thought this through, and I am confident in it," is a complete sentence. It offers nothing further to grab onto and pull you back into a debate that was never going anywhere productive. There is a practical way to build this skill if it does not come naturally at first. Before a conversation you suspect will invite over-explaining, decide in advance on your single short sentence and commit to it as your complete answer regardless of what follow-up pressure arrives. Having the sentence prepared ahead of time removes the improvisational scramble that usually leads people back into lengthy justification, because the short answer is already sitting there, ready, rather than something you have to construct on the spot under social pressure. The third move, and the one that takes the most practice, is learning to sit inside the silence that follows disapproval without rushing to fill it. This is where most people crack. You say your piece, the other person's face falls or their tone cools, and the silence that follows feels unbearable, as though it is expanding to fill the entire room. To make it stop, people instinctively throw more words into the gap, hoping the words will dissolve the discomfort. But the silence is not actually your enemy in that moment. It is where a very specific kind of strength gets built. Sitting through someone's disapproval without immediately scrambling to fix it proves something to you that no explanation ever could, that you can survive being disapproved of, and that the disapproval, uncomfortable as it feels, does not actually cost you anything essential. It is worth practicing this in low-stakes situations before you need it in high-stakes ones. The next time a minor decision of yours gets a lukewarm or skeptical reaction from someone, practice simply letting the silence sit for a few extra seconds instead of immediately filling it with justification. Notice specifically that the world does not end and the relationship does not collapse. That small, repeated evidence, gathered deliberately in low-stakes moments, is what makes the skill available to you later when the stakes are considerably higher. The fourth move is the long game, and it is ultimately the most powerful one of the 4. Build something real enough that it eventually speaks for itself, so that you stop needing anyone's argument-based agreement at all. This is not a quick fix. It takes months, sometimes years, but once something genuinely real exists, a finished project, a changed circumstance, a visible result, the entire dynamic shifts. You are no longer trying to win an argument about whether your decision made sense. The decision has already proven itself in the only currency that ever actually persuades a genuine skeptic, which is results rather than rhetoric. This move works precisely because it redirects the energy that was previously being spent on persuasion toward the thing that actually generates persuasive evidence in the first place. Every hour reclaimed from rehearsing explanations becomes an hour available for the actual building. Over enough months, that redirected energy compounds into something that would have taken considerably longer to produce if a meaningful fraction of your attention had continued leaking into justification instead. For the specific, difficult moments when someone you genuinely care about is visibly disappointed and everything in you wants to fix it immediately with an explanation, here is a small, practical test worth carrying with you. Ask yourself one honest question before you speak. Is this person's understanding actually available to me right now in this specific moment, or am I about to spend energy trying to unlock something that simply is not unlockable yet? Not whether you wish they understood, not whether they deserve an explanation in some abstract sense, simply whether their understanding is genuinely available to receive anything right now. More often than people expect, when someone is actively upset, frightened, or defensive in the moment, the honest answer is no. Their understanding is not currently available, no matter how skillfully you explain yourself. It may become available later, once emotions have settled and some time and evidence have accumulated. But forcing the issue in the heated moment itself rarely produces anything except more heat. When the honest answer is no, the wisest response is not coldness. It is a brief, warm acknowledgement followed by a genuine pause. Something like, "I hear that you are worried. I have made my decision, and we can talk again once things have settled." Then you actually let it rest there, instead of circling back within the hour to try again while the other person is still not in a place to actually receive anything new. Forcing understanding before it is ready tends to produce exactly what forcing unripe fruit produces: something bitter and unfinished, when patience would have eventually produced something genuinely good on its own timeline. It is worth adding a practical note on timing here, because knowing that understanding is not currently available does not mean it will never become available. Revisiting the conversation later, once the initial emotional charge has genuinely settled, once the person has had time to observe how things actually unfold, is often far more productive than either forcing the issue in the heated moment or simply avoiding the topic permanently. The test is not a permanent verdict on the relationship. It is a read on the current moment, and the current moment changes. It is worth being clear about what all of this is not. This is not a blueprint for becoming closed off, hardened, or unwilling to ever explain yourself to anyone. That would trade one problem for a different, arguably worse one. Genuine communication, real mutual understanding, remains one of the richest parts of being connected to other people, and none of what we have covered today is meant to talk you out of that. What we are actually building is discernment, the specific and learnable ability to tell the difference between people who have genuinely earned your reasons through real care and real capacity to receive them, and people who have simply demanded your reasons through proximity, habit, or emotional pressure. It is the ability to recognize an open door from a closed one, and to stop knocking politely on doors that were locked deliberately from the inside. Your energy is genuinely finite. You only get a certain amount of it in a day, in a year, in an entire life, and every unit spent explaining yourself to someone who was never going to listen is a unit you did not spend on the people who actually deserve your warmth, or on the work that is actually trying to become real. Constant over-explaining does not make you generous. It simply makes you depleted, one unnecessary justification at a time, while feeling, the whole time, like you were simply being thorough and respectful. There is a broader point worth sitting with here, which is that this entire pattern is ultimately about where you locate the authority over your own life. Every time you treat someone's understanding as a prerequisite for moving forward, you are quietly handing them a kind of authority over your decisions that they never actually earned and that you never actually needed to grant. Reclaiming that authority is not about becoming harsher or more distant toward the people around you. It is about correctly recognizing that your life was never actually up for a vote. Even during the years, it felt like it was. So if you take one thing from the last 35 minutes, let it be this. Real peace is not the day everyone finally understands you. That day, chased directly, tends to never actually arrive, because it depends entirely on people who have no obligation to give you what you are waiting for. Real peace is the willingness to be misunderstood by some people and to keep moving forward anyway. It is deciding first, sharing only with those who have earned it, offering the short, honest answer instead of the fifth explanation, and sitting comfortably enough in the silence that follows disapproval that it stops having any real power over you. Your reasons belong to you. You may share them freely and warmly with people who have genuinely earned that sharing. You do not owe them to everyone who simply demands them. And the moment you stop pouring your limited energy into people who were never going to listen, you get that energy back, all of it, and finally get to spend it on the only thing that has ever actually answered a genuine doubter anyway. Not a sharper argument, a life that is quietly, undeniably working. You do not need to resolve every relationship in this pattern today, and you do not need to become perfectly skilled at any of the 4 moves overnight. Pick one conversation this week where you suspect this pattern has been quietly running, and try just one piece of what we covered, the short answer, the decided first approach, or simply sitting through a few extra seconds of silence you would normally rush to fill. Notice what actually happens. In almost every case, it will be considerably less catastrophic than the anticipation made it feel, and that single piece of evidence is usually enough to make the next attempt a little easier than the one before it.